So now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about something called the brain-gut axis. And this is one of the hottest topics in psychiatry and mental health right now. There's some really recent research which has shown that our brain and our gut are actually very intimately connected. And there are all kinds of signals and other kinds of things that travel between our brain and our gut. And one of the most interesting novel areas of psychiatric treatment development is actually on working on our GI system to improve our mental health. And so even though this is sort of a super hot and novel topic right now, and there's a ton of research money going into it, it's not exactly a new idea. For the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, Ayurvedic physicians in India have sort of said that actually most of our mental problems start in our GI tract. And they've also said that the first line treatment to mental health is actually dietary change. And so these ideas, while they're sort of new and hot, aren't actually new if you kind of look at it. And this is what's really interesting is that, if you had asked a psychiatrist 40 or 50 years ago, if they had a conversation with an Ayurvedic physician, and the Ayurvedic physician sort of said, yeah, if someone has depression, what you should do is change their diet, the psychiatrist would have been like, this is completely crazy. It's like super pseudoscientific. There's no reality to this. That the mind and the brain are completely different organs, and the gut is a completely different organ, and the two have nothing to do with themselves. So I think it's really fascinating that recent advances in medicine actually make it so that some of these traditional systems of medicine like Ayurveda and Chinese medicine are actually becoming more aligned with Western medicine. And so we don't actually need a PhD or to be a researcher to actually know that our brain and our gut are connected. Because this is actually the common human experience, right? If I have a huge presentation the next day, I'm gonna feel butterflies in my stomach. If I'm going out on a blind date, then I'm gonna feel really, really queasy down here. And we also know, for example, in pediatric cases of depression and anxiety, oftentimes the presenting complaint is a child who kind of complains about stomach pain. So we definitely know that our mood has a lot to do with the way that our stomach kind of feels. So now what I'd like to do is kind of dig into this principle a little bit more, share a little bit more about the science behind this sort of thing, and then we'll kind of wrap up with a couple of ideas about how we can leverage the brain-gut axis to move in the right direction. We're going to go over three different ways in which our brain and our gut are connected. So the first one that I want to talk about is actually via direct neuronal connection. And so a neuron is a nerve cell, and they're basically a bunch of nerves that literally connect our brain to our gut. So one example of these is something called the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve travels from the brain down to the gut. The vagus nerve also affects a lot of other organs along the way. It affects our heart rate, it affects our blood pressure, it affects things like peristalsis, which is the transit of food and other substances kind of through our GI tract. And so our nerves literally connect our brain and our gut. And a lot of signals get transmitted back and forth via these nerves. And so this is really fascinating because actually some of the most interesting theories in neurodegenerative diseases like dementia and Parkinson's actually suggest that these diseases start in your GI system and then travel to your brain. I know it sounds absolutely wild, but I'm going to kind of explain a little bit. We have to learn a little bit about things like Parkinson's to sort of illustrate this point. So first, Parkinson's is a degenerative disease of a part of our brain called the basal ganglia. So we have this one little part of our brain called the basal ganglia, and it's got a bunch of neurons, and these neurons produce dopamine. And this is the part of our brain that governs movement. So when I kind of move my arm like this, there's a part of my brain that sort of allows that to happen very smoothly. And what happens in Parkinson's disease, unfortunately, is that these cells in our basal ganglia that are responsible for this get kind of filled up with this toxic waste product called a Lewy body. And so essentially what we've got is a neuron that gets filled up with all these Lewy bodies. The neuron can't really clear the Lewy bodies, and then eventually the neuron just dies. And so the more that our brain and our basal ganglia gets filled with these Lewy bodies, the more cell death we see and the worse that Parkinson's gets. So then the question is, okay, that's fine. So we know that Lewy bodies kind of destroy the basal ganglia neurons, but what does that have to do with our GI system? Well, it turns out that there's actually some very interesting recent evidence that suggests that the Lewy bodies get produced in our GI system and travel via things like the vagus nerve into our brain. So all these toxic waste products that are killing brain cells actually are potentially coming from the gut. And there's even some really interesting evidence to support this. For example, if you look at a child who has a GI bug, they have a gastrointestinal illness, they have diarrhea, vomiting, things like that, and you do something called a biopsy, which is when you actually take a piece of their intestine out and you look at it under a microscope, what you see is that GI bugs create Lewy bodies in our GI tract. And so it's really fascinating because anytime there's inflammation in the gut, it leads to Lewy body formation in the gut. And then there's also some evidence that those Lewy bodies will actually travel up the vagus nerve and into our brain. So it's really kind of fascinating. We don't really have this 100% figured out, but it does seem like there's a very clear connection between our brain and our gut via direct neuronal connection between those two pieces. So that's one way in which our brain and gut interact. The second way in which they interact is via neurotransmitter production. So our gut system is actually filled with bacteria, and we have a very symbiotic relationship with these bacteria. And what that means is that we do something for the bacteria, and the bacteria do something for us. And one of the biggest things that the bacteria in our GI system do for us is they break down food and other things that we put in there, and they turn those kinds of foods and things like that into useful products for our body. And one of the biggest things that they do is actually make neurotransmitters. Well, they don't technically make neurotransmitters, but they make the building blocks that then travel into our bloodstream and then turn into neurotransmitters, like serotonin. So literally what's going on is we've got all these bacteria in our gut, and we actually feed them. Anytime you eat food, some of that food travels, or all of it travels to your gut, hopefully, and then the bacteria break that down, they use it for their own resources, and they literally have channels in the bacterial cell that will take like a piece of broccoli, break it down, they'll eat some of it, and then they'll give us a serotonin precursor, and they'll actually transport that serotonin precursor into our bloodstream. That molecule then travels up to our brain and gets turned into something like serotonin or dopamine. So it's a super symbiotic relationship. And it's really critical that we have the right kind of bacteria, because studies show that in people who have depression and anxiety, some of these bacteria that produce neurotransmitter precursors or neurotransmitter building blocks are actually lacking. And clinically, this sort of perfectly makes sense, right? Because we know that we use serotonergic medications, these are things like anti-anxiety and anti-depression medications, that will boost the level of serotonin in our brain. And so if we really kind of stop and think about it very, very simply, very logically, what we find is, okay, so if my brain is deficient in serotonin, why is my brain deficient in serotonin? Most people's brains are not deficient in serotonin. Or even a year or two ago, I had a perfectly normal level of serotonin. So what happened? And when you look at those patients, what you find is they're actually lacking in the bacteria that produce the serotonin building blocks. And so in clinical practice, what I'll oftentimes do when people come into my office is we know that, okay, this person's got low serotonin, let's give them a pharmaceutical medication. And while they're taking that medication, it's artificially boosting their serotonin. And at the same time, we do a lot of Ayurvedic diet stuff to get their gut bacteria in the right place. And then this is the really magical and awesome part, is that once the gut bacteria is all in place, we don't really know because we can't really test it, but once they've been on an Ayurvedic diet for a long time, then we start to pull the serotonergic medication off. And if they've done a good job with following the diet recommendations and doing a couple of these other things, then they actually feel completely fine without that extra serotonin. And my hypothesis is that's because we've supported the gut bacteria to grow in the right way and actually naturally provide serotonin to their body that they were previously missing. So that's number two, which is that our gut has bacteria in it which produce neurotransmitter precursors, and those neurotransmitters tend to be what's deficient in things like depression and anxiety. So on to number three. So we talked about symbiotic bacteria, and in some cases, we also have unhelpful bacteria in our guts. So this creates a state of dysbiosis, which means, so symbiosis is when you're working together. Dysbiosis is when the bacteria isn't really like playing nice with the rest of your gut cells. So in dysbiosis, you have these kind of unhelpful bacteria that are not friendly, are not helpful. And so our body recognizes these bacteria as enemies and tries to kill them. And so this creates sort of this pro-inflammatory state in the gut. And if we go back to what we learned about Lewy body production, anytime we have inflammation in the gut, we're going to be producing these toxic waste products. So in cases of dysbiosis, we have these unhelpful bacteria. Our body thinks that, oh no, we've got to get these guys out of here, and it actually turns our immune system and creates inflammation. Now what we have to do is really go into like how inflammation works, because inflammation isn't just localized to the area where the bacteria exist, okay? So this is what I want you guys to imagine. So we have this thing called an intestinal wall, which is literally like a wall, right? So like on one side of the intestinal wall, we have our organs and stuff, and on the other side of the intestinal wall, we have that empty tube called our GI tract. And I know this sounds really bizarre, but actually your GI tract is outside of your body. And this is just weird, but just bear with me, okay? So like my mouth is technically outside my body, right? This is not inside my body. And then even my esophagus is connected to my mouth, so that's actually outside my body. Your stomach is actually outside of your body, and even your intestines are outside of your body, which sort of makes sense because when I eat food, that food kind of travels along my GI system and then comes out as stool. So there's actually a hole that runs through your body, or a tube, and that's our GI system. So our body tries to keep everything on the inside that tube kind of outside of our body. And it does that through this thing called an intestinal wall. And whenever we have unhelpful bacteria, what our body basically does is it's almost like a castle wall with a gate. And inside the castle wall, we have our immune system, which are all of our soldiers, our white blood cells. And anytime there's unhelpful bacteria on the outside of the castle wall, it opens the gate, our immune cells flood out, and they try to do war with the bacteria in our gut. In that process, the gate opens and our intestinal wall becomes leaky. So all kinds of crud from these bacteria kind of trickle into our body and create a state of inflammation. Now the key thing here is that when we're in a state of inflammation, we produce something called cytokines. And cytokines are pro-inflammatory molecules that actually travel throughout our entire bloodstream. So if you think about it, even if I have kind of a cut right here, and that cut gets infected, you're gonna feel fever through your entire body, right? You can have a localized infection that has a body-wide effect. And so the same thing happens in our gut. When we have gut inflammation, it actually affects everything in our whole body. And there's some recent evidence that actually suggests that depression especially is actually an inflammation of the brain. And there are some very recent studies that actually show that anti-inflammatory medicines may actually help depression. And we can also see this in terms of some of these herbs that are effective for depression that have anti-inflammatory qualities like turmeric. So the third way that we kind of see that our brain and our gut are connected are actually via dysbiosis and an inflammation that may actually travel all the way to the brain. So now people are probably wondering, okay, fine, so like these are the three ways that they're connected, and it seems like it really comes down to which bacteria live in my gut. So how do we get the right bacteria in our gut? And this is where we need to kind of take a step back and think about diet. And now what I'm really gonna do, I wanna highlight this for a second because this is really where we leave the research behind. Because there's really good scientific evidence for everything that I've said so far. But now what I'm gonna do is try to bridge the gap between what Ayurveda has been saying for thousands of years, which we know is clinically effective, and then we've got the research over here. But what I'm really gonna talk about is that clinical intervention in the middle to change your gut bacteria. But to be completely honest, there really aren't many studies on this, okay? So here's what we're gonna do. So we're gonna talk a little bit about what bacteria are symbiotic. So if you think about how human guts have evolved, right? We've evolved with a particular kind of bacteria that are really common. And which bacteria grow in your gut? Well, it depends on which ones you feed. So not all bacteria eat the same kind of food. Some bacteria will subsist off of things like meat. Other bacteria will subsist off of things like fibrous and cruciferous vegetables, like broccoli and cabbage. And other bacteria will be able to break down carbohydrates. So the symbiotic bacteria that we have in our gut basically are the ones that we evolved with. So these are the ones that eat the diet that human beings have been eating for like thousands or millions of years. And what we see right now is that when we start to eat more processed foods, when we start to eat foods that are like high in sugar and have all these other things that we never evolved to eat, it actually selects for a different kind of bacteria. And as we select for these kind of unhealthy bacteria, they start to create all these levels of low degree inflammation and stuff like that. And if you talk to people, for example, who have acne, they'll tell you that, oh, if I change my diet, my acne absolutely gets worse. And so if you think about how does that even work? How does like zits on my face have anything to do with what I eat? And it's all mediated through these kind of avenues that we're sharing today. So the way to get healthy bacteria is basically to eat the right kinds of food. And this is kind of fascinating because for thousands of years, you have multiple cultures that have sort of figured this out. From all over the world, we've got cultures that will eat particular kinds of fermented food. Like you'll have kimchi from Korea, or you'll have yogurt, which has been used in many parts of the world, or even miso, which is actually fermented. And if you look at the way that these foods are prepared, for example, if you look at, traditional Japanese methods of making miso soup, there's a really important part to making miso soup the right way, which is that you boil the water first, let it cool a little bit, and then you add the miso to water that's at a temperature right below boiling. And so if you think about it, why do the Japanese do it that way? And if we add the miso first, and if we actually boil the miso soup, it actually kills all the probiotics in there. It kills all the helpful bacteria in there. So it's really fascinating that cultures have actually been doing this the right way. And so if we think about, okay, how do I get the right bacteria? So the first thing is that we can eat particular kinds of fermented foods, right? And we can see that, for example, yogurt does have beneficial probiotics, seems to help us out a lot. There's actually some evidence, for example, that kimchi can prevent stomach ulcers because stomach ulcers are actually caused by unhelpful bacteria. And there's a hypothesis that eating kimchi, so we know actually there's good evidence that kimchi can help prevent stomach ulcers, but people are hypothesizing that the bacteria that are in kimchi actually fight against and produce local antibiotics that will kill the bacteria that cause ulcers. So we know that there are a lot of good bacteria that we can get from the foods that we eat. And particularly what we're going to go into is the Ayurvedic tradition. Because in Ayurveda, they sort of figured out that there are particular bacteria that or particular foods that work for anxiety, particular foods that work for depression. And I think the mechanism that we're working on there is actually that when you eat a particular kind of food, it selects for and fertilizes your gut to grow a particular kind of bacteria that will produce the neurotransmitters and other things that you need to sort of fix that anxiety. And the same is true for depression, where there's certain foods that will sort of cultivate the right gut environment to grow anti-depression bacteria. Now, this is the cool thing because now we kind of get back to science. And there have been some studies, and these are the most wild studies that I've ever read, okay? Where what they'll do is they'll take people with depression and anxiety, and they'll actually do something called a stool transplant, which is exactly what it sounds like. They'll take the stool from a healthy person, and stool is actually 50% bacteria, by the way, and they'll transplant that stool into an unhealthy person. So they'll take stool from someone who doesn't have depression and actually transfer it over to people with depression. And what they find is that with a stool transplant, the depression actually comes down. Now, this is research that we really, most of this research is actually still in mice and other kinds of model, but there have been a couple of small studies which show that actually doing things like stool transplants, or I know this sounds really disgusting, but most human beings aren't going to get a stool transplant, right? You're not going to bend over and have someone stick someone else's stool up your butt. So what most of the studies, what they do, and this is actually even grosser, what they'll do is they'll put capsules, which are derived from the stool of other people that have the right bacteria in it, and then we'll take it orally. And if you really think about it, that's what probiotics are, right? So probiotics are actually like ingesting certain kinds of bacteria. And the wild thing is that this stuff actually works, okay? So just to sort of summarize, this talk is all about introducing y'all to a really awesome and burgeoning area of research within mental health, which is the brain-gut axis. And Ayurveda and other forms of traditional medicine have been sort of emphasizing the right kind of diet for our mental health for thousands of years. And what I think is really cool is the recent research has sort of shown us what the mechanism of action is that Ayurveda has been using clinically for thousands of years. And there are three major connections that we're kind of thinking about. The first is direct neuronal connections between our brain and our gut. The second is to remember that symbiotic bacteria are actually making neurotransmitter precursors that our brain is going to use to create the neurotransmitters we need to keep things like depression and anxiety at bay. And the third is that dysbiotic bacteria, or dysbiosis, is going to lead to inflammation in our gut, and that inflammation can actually have a body-wide effect and lead to neuroinflammation. So now what we're going to do is go into some basic principles about how to use this information to select the right kind of diet, to support the right kind of bacteria, and hopefully get a better handle on things like depression and anxiety.
Apple 13, brain, gut, anxiety, depression. Take 2, pick up 80 common.
I like it when Trevor says AB common. I don't know why.